colloquium of the year, presented as we have had the pleasure of since last year as part of the Arts and Design Monday nights here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. There was a brief moment earlier this summer before we had the full details of this event worked out when it appeared on our listings that this event was going to involve myself, Nicholas Thompson, in conversation with Frank Foer. I'm delighted to say that you will not have me inflicted upon you this evening. Rather, we have the enormous pleasure and I would even argue privilege of welcoming Nicholas Thompson, editor-in-chief of Wired, to talk with us and to talk with our guest tonight, Frank Foer. So let me briefly introduce them both. Actually, I forgot one thing. I have two events to plug. Get the plugs out of the way first while I still have your attention. The first event is, of course, our next Monday's lecture in this A+D Mondays series, where we'll have Tanya Barguera discussing Arte Utile, which is in some ways a reflection also of tonight's conversation, how the arts engage in a useful way in the world. So I welcome you to come to that conversation as well. And then, of course, next Thursday, the Berkeley Center for New Media is hosting an event which is even more directly related to this conversation in the Banatao Auditorium in the Citrus Building, where just by Euclid Avenue and the entrance to the campus there, we're hosting a day-long event called Reply All, Free Speech in the Age of Social Media, discussing the issues that have reverberated in our campus and around the world and the nation in the last year, starting off with an introduction by the Chancellor, Carol Christ, and a keynote by Robert Reich, and going on from there, including with speakers including Ed Wasserman, the Dean of Journalism, here with us tonight. So when I lived, after I graduated from college, when I lived in London, I was an avid reader of the magazine that Nick Thompson is now the editor-in-chief of, for its ability to transmit to the old world the feeling of, dare I say, disruption and excitement and engagement that digital culture was starting to seep and beam out of the Bay Area into the world. Then Wired magazine, with its from its introductory graphic design freefall to its closing article by Nick Negroponte, was a way to think about technology and how it might and would affect the culture at large. Today, of course, we are in the culture that Wired both predicted and also in some ways failed to predict, at least in some of its more dystopian components. We can hardly blame them, but it is a really interesting moment, and I really want to say that we're very lucky here in the Bay Area to have Nick Thompson, who of course did such an amazing job advancing the digital content of the New Yorker before he came to Wired, as a editor and individual to articulate what is now the profound effect of technology on our society as a whole. He is in many ways the perfect person to converse with our banner guest this evening, journalist Frank Foer. It's been my distinct pleasure to have known Frank for a long, long time. He made the very sensible decision of marrying one of my most wonderful friends from college, and in many ways he's been part of my family in ways big and small for several decades. What I remember most about Frank from the very first time I met him was how amazing he was to talk to. And in many ways, one of the best things I can say about the book that Frank is talking about tonight, it is the quintessential distillation of the feeling of talking to Frank. As I've read it over the last couple of weeks, I've rejoiced in the sense of connectivity, of sheer excitement about ideas and their message and the relationships between them. And Frank therefore manages to make a book which is an urgent and difficult indictment of many conditions of the intersections of technology and society into something that's just enormously fun to read. as well, and that is his particular gift. And I will stop talking about that gift and allow you to experience it firsthand very shortly. Frank has a resume that goes back to the early days of digital journalism at Slate Magazine. He has been twice editor of the New Republic and is also a remarkable author in his own right, particularly in talking about the public space of sports. His other favorite book of mine is, of course, a very profound tome on how soccer explains the world, which I highly recommend to you as well. And so we welcome into the public space of the campus and into the public discourse that we seek to create here about technology, art, and culture and the society as a whole, two incredible guests, Nick Thompson and Frank Foer, and I will stop talking now and allow you to enjoy their conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you to everybody here. I was told we needed 30 people to beat Milo. It looks like we have done that in spades, so I'm grateful to everybody who showed up. Please turn off your digital devices, both because it will distract and because it will violate chapters 1, 3, and 5 of Frank's book, unless you're going to tweet or put on Facebook profound critiques of his of social media. That is allowed. Otherwise, we're good. This is his book. It's fantastic. Everybody, please read it. Let's get going. Frank, hello.
Hey, Nick.
How are you?
Does this thing work? I'm not sure it works.
I think it's... We good?
Now it's working.
So one quick diversion after my other two diversions. I wrote a story about antitrust and technology 10 years ago when I was a journalist in my first tenure at Wired before leaving for the New Yorker. And it was all about AT&T's efforts to try to break up Google as a monopolist. And the person I called who best explained how the law of monopoly worked and how it could apply to Google was a man named Foer, who was one of my sources and my key explainers in that story, and that is Frank's father. And so that is a sort of a wonderful way. The book is dedicated to Bert, and I think it's a wonderful way it comes full circle. Let me ask you something about the book. So the book starts, and it begins with kind of the early dreams of technology founders. It's got Stuart Brand, there's Marshall McLuhan, there's the sense that there's going to be a collective consciousness, global consciousness. It's actually possibly a really good thing. Then after about chapter 2, it gets, or maybe after about chapter 1, it gets really dark. And you make the determination that the good things have not happened and the bad things have. But were there moments when you were writing your book and you started to really dig into Google and Facebook where you thought, wait a second, actually maybe it's kind of great. Maybe we will get this wonderful collective human consciousness. Tell me your thought process and the moments of optimism, because there's not a ton of optimism in the book, even though the book, mind you, is awesome.
Well, we live in a culture, and the air in which we breathe is optimistic. That we worship these devices, and I argue for probably pretty good reasons. I mean, they really are incredible inventions. And when I wrote this book, I looked up many questions on Google. I ordered books on Amazon, and I exploited the self-promotional possibilities of Facebook, which is probably part of the reason some of you guys are here tonight. So I'm not anti-technology. But let me just unpack. Let me tell the story that you allude to, which is about the birth of the internet. And one of the spectacular confluences, and it's probably not a coincidence, in the history of technology, is that it was born in San Francisco's Mid-Peninsula, which is also the place where the Grateful Dead and LSD come from. And so you had the technology industry, you had Silicon Valley growing up alongside the counterculture. And the two things rubbed off on one another. You mentioned Stuart Brand, who was, of course, the author of the Whole Earth Catalog, which is this really eclectic, interesting amalgamation of genres. It was Steve Jobs called it the Bible of his generation. Now, Stuart Brand was a hippie. He hung out with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, and he wanted to create a publication that appealed to all the people who'd gone off to live in the communes of the late 60s and the early 1970s. And it's just really hard to imagine that nearly 1 million people went off to live in the communes during that period, and they went off in order to build a utopia. They were real communities, and the people who went off were going to achieve a different state of consciousness based on their connection to one another and their connection to the land. And Brand went off and he created this catalog that was intended to not just explain what was happening in the communes, but to actually sell things to them. I mean, his thesis was that people needed tools in order to realize the dreams, the latent potential of the communes. And so Brand went off and he created the Whole Earth catalog, and he became a seminal figure in the history of technology, not just because of the Whole Earth catalog, but because he hung out in the labs in Silicon Valley, and he was able to see things in a way more clearly than other people did, and he came up with the term personal computer, and he created kind of the gestalt of Silicon Valley, which was that they would take, the communes failed. They were massive flops. And he was going to try to replicate the beautiful dream, the lyrical dream that was inherent in these communes through technology. And so that's why we get this idea of the network and the internet and everything. The whole mode of thinking, I argue, for Silicon Valley is a collectivist one. That media is social, collaboration is the thing, it's crowdsourcing, and it's a beautiful dream, except when it gets captured by big firms, because the internet was not just, the internet was the greatest business opportunity in human history, it turns out. And these ideas, this celebration of oneness, ultimately became the basis for monopoly. It became, with the network, there can only be really one entity that captures the network.
So if that's the case, do you think that the outcome we have now is inevitable, right? Network effects, right? So Facebook is more valuable for the second person than the first person. After the first two people are on it, it becomes more valuable for the third person, right? So it builds and builds, and ultimately it becomes very hard to create a competitor to Facebook. So there's an argument that just by the structure of the internet, monopoly was inevitable. And if your argument is monopoly is what killed the dream, then therefore the death of the dream was inevitable. But can you make the argument that maybe there was a fork in the road at some point, or there was a mistake that somebody made? Like, did the early dream of the collectivist, crowdsourced, wonderful, human-enhancing internet, did it have to go away?
Here's what I know.
Yeah.
Which is
yes or no, Frank?
Which is that I will not submit to your binary dictates. So one thing we know about networks is that they're inherent in communications, and they're inherent in lots and lots of different industries. The railroads were a network. The telephone and the telegraph were networks. And to some extent, we need networks because it doesn't make sense to have more than one telephone network. I mean, you can conceive of an architecture, and ultimately we were able to conceive of an architecture for the telephone system that meant that there wasn't just AT&T. And I think that the same is kind of true for the internet, that there was an ideology, this ideology of oneness, this ideology of connection, the fetishization of the network. I think there was that led us to the place where we're in. But I do think that it's possible to conceive of a different structure. There's no reason why there needs to be one search engine or one social network or one store that we buy all of our crap from. It's possible to imagine a world where there's actually competition. So part of it has to do with the moment that the internet was born. Not only did it have an idea of itself and a utopian aspiration, but the internet was privatized. The internet was invented and run by the Department of Defense and then handed over to the National Science Foundation. And in the late 80s and early 90s, the internet was privatized. And that was the moment where everything was unleashed. And I think privatizing it was the right call. But we have to think about that moment. That was the moment when the Cold War ended. That was the moment when Reaganomics ruled the roost. And so the internet was privatized at a moment when we thought of government as getting in the way, when regulation was something that could only slow down innovation. And so I think that there was a confluence. If the internet was invented in the year 2017, I think the political circumstances, the politics of it all, would have probably led to a different shape.
So you think if we hadn't had the Clintonian free market, Bush-Clinton, early 90s moment, and there had been tougher regulation, or even Obama, you can throw him in here, he had almost no antitrust regulation. If you had had a tougher antitrust enforcement, tougher government regulation, possibly, I don't know, better enforcement of the 94 Telecommunications Act, we would have a very different internet today and therefore a very different society?
Yeah, I don't know if it would have been antitrust that would have been the key, but I think that there maybe would have been more rules that would have been imposed. That the government would have said, okay, this is our thing, and we're handing it over to the public and to corporations to be run in this sort of way. And I mean, this is a counterfactual, and I could be dead wrong about it.
And we'd never know.
And we would never know. That's the beauty. I like to argue counterfactuals for that very reason. But yes, I think that it would have been different. I think that especially when it came to the question of antitrust, I think we wouldn't have necessarily given these companies such a long leash.
All right, I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about antitrust, but before I do that, explain.
Can you imagine? There's a room full of people, and you're going to listen to questions about antitrust. My dad would be so happy.
You're allowed to leave. There's one exit right there. I believe there's an exit in the back. Before I do that, though, why don't you spend a minute and explain why you think the big time? Because the argument is not big is bad, tech is bad, oh my gosh, those people got rich, I'm jealous. Your argument is much more sophisticated than that. So please explain what you don't like about our friends at GAFA.
I'm only a wee bit jealous. So my argument is that these companies occupy a very important place in our democracy. That these companies stand between us and information. That these companies are different than the monopolies that have gone before. They're different for a couple different reasons. One is that they aspire to encompass everything. And that sounds conspiratorial and that sounds crazy, but consider, Google started off as the company that was going to organize knowledge. Well, that wasn't an ambitious enough mission for Google. And so they've branched into building self-driving cars. They're a life sciences company. Amazon set out to be the everything store, but wow, that's just small potatoes. And so they power the cloud. They are a movie studio. They own your organic grocery store now. And so these companies want to, and that goal, I think, is ultimately most visible in the way in which they want to become your personal assistant. That they want to wake you in the morning, and they have their little boxes that with their artificial intelligence that you're in conversation with all across the day. Now, these things are amazing, and these are incredible efficiencies, and in a lot of ways, they've made our lives much better. But the argument of my book is that just because these companies have delivered fantastic things for us, and just because we can look at them as incredible innovations, doesn't mean that we should be blind to the dark side. We should just withhold skepticism when it's applied to these companies. And one thing that is profoundly different about them is that ever since human beings existed, we've had tools. And those tools have been an extension of us. And you could argue that technology is one of the things that actually defines us as human beings. And so we've gone through this long process of automation, where various human activities have been mechanized. And that's unleashed incredible economic growth and incredible, it's improved human life in immeasurable sorts of ways. But what these companies are automating isn't upper body strength. They're not helping us plow the fields better. They're automating mental processes. And we're merging with these machines. we wear them on our wrists, we wear them on the bridge of our nose, and it's not a stretch to imagine that they'll be implanted within us. But what I want us to consider is that we're not just merging with these machines, we're merging with the companies that run the machines. And so they have values and they have aspirations for us, and they're able to impose them on us because of our dependence on them and because of their economic power.
All right.
All right.
Great.
All right,
Now,
thesis out of the way.
thesis out of the way. So one of the questions about antitrust, and this is one of the key things, is that
Back to antitrust.
Yeah. I got to ask a couple questions, but this is kind of amazing, right? So Frank is like a friend of mine who wrote a book about Al-Qaeda that came out like right before 9/11. I mean, this is like really good timing. Frank puts out his book like right at the moment where the whole world starts to focus on antitrust.
It's kind of funny because when I started, I felt like people looked at me weird when I said that I was going to write a book critical of these companies. But now I got asked by a guy on the radio the other day who accused me of mouthing conventional wisdom.
Right. Right. There are now like different brands of antitrust. There's like hipster antitrust. There's all like, I think Orrin Hatch used the phrase hipster antitrust on the U.S. Senate 2 weeks ago. So the problem with antitrust, as you know, as the son of Bert Foer, is that traditionally under American law, you have to make things bad for consumers. And the thing about these companies is they make things great for consumers, right? Google is free. Facebook, I haven't ever paid a penny to Facebook. Amazon, like, they're cutting prices left and right. Google is giving away its self-driving car technology. They are doing amazing things. They are not hurting consumers at all. So kind of hard to make the antitrust argument given that. In your book, you lay out Brandeis's view. You say that if Brandeis were around today, he would think these companies are too large. But you don't say what to do. And that is the thing. One thing I wanted from your book that you don't have in there. So, what is you say there should be a Data Protection Act, and you say generally that we should be more like Europe. But what exactly should the United States do about antitrust with these companies?
Yeah, and I say that they should consider breaking up the companies if I admit that I probably hedged.
Like you skate a little.
I hedged on that probably more than I should have. So I'll say it.
Damn it!
Yeah.
Bring it here.
Okay.
First time ever. Frank Foer is going to lay out.
Let's bust them
what
up.
we should do on antitrust right now. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, let's bust them up. So the problem that you're describing is very, very real, which is that when we think about monopoly, we're thinking about one thing right now in American law, which is prices. So that wasn't always the case. Antitrust was essentially invented by Louis Brandeis, who Nick mentioned, who was a Supreme Court justice, and he was a lawyer turned crusader. He was Jewish, but kind of masqueraded as a Boston Brahmin, and he took on a series of cases where he represented firms that were. My dad was also a small businessman, and Brandeis liked representing the small businessmen who were kind of outsiders because the big companies wouldn't go with a Jewish lawyer, basically. And so he was kind of stuck in the late 19th century. So he was stuck with kind of the outsiders and pressing the case of the outsiders, which gave him this unique vantage point. Brandeis is interesting for a couple reasons. The first is that he came up with our idea of privacy. He first came up with it in the 1890s when he was just a lawyer, and he wrote a law article that was complaining about gossip. And gossip is bad. I guess we could stipulate, but it really wasn't the thing that really annoyed him about invasions of privacy. And so over the course of his tenure as a Supreme Court justice, he evolved a really sophisticated, really powerful definition of privacy, which we can get to in a minute. Then the other thing he was concerned about was preserving competitive capitalism. And he just hated the idea that gigantic firms would squash markets. He was a real believer in Thomas Jefferson. That was his hero. And so when he was thinking about monopoly, he was thinking about it as a threat to us as citizens. The reason that he feared big companies was that the people who worked for big companies would have no other place to go. They'd be stuck working for their employer, and if their employer told them to vote in an election one way, they wouldn't do it. They would follow the lead of their employee, and that's a pretty abstract fear of monopoly. It's not exactly what drives me bonkers, although it's we can get to it. I think there's a train of thought that continues to the present if we follow through his logic. But the point is that he cared about bigness because he cared about democracy, and it was connected to his ideas about privacy. And that was a view of antitrust that reigned until the 1960s, when Judge Robert Bork, he of that funky beard, wrote an article saying that the reason we have antitrust laws is because we care about consumer welfare. And that became the mantra from 1965 up through the present, that the reason we care about monopoly because we want prices to be low. And that was something that the left and the right signed on to. If you were Ralph Nader and you were crusading on behalf of consumers, the consumer was everything. That became an important part of our political discourse on the left, is that we cared about protecting the rights of consumers. Well, then fast forward to the present. As Nick suggests, if you look at these companies, if you're just judging them on the basis of price, they're awesome. Who could complain about the price that Google is charging you? Or who could complain about Amazon's prices? They are simply lower than the competition's. And that's why I think we need to shift back to a more Brandeisian conception of antitrust, where we consider values other than simply efficiency and low prices. That if we think about the threat that the size of these companies pose, I think we would find that they threaten other values that we hold dear. Not just the question of privacy, but I think that I think there's an argument to be made that the reason that these companies have thrived and achieved the status that they've achieved is that they have collected more and better data than their competitors, which creates the incentive to surveil even more and to collect more data in order to preserve their competitive position. I think if we look at the way in which everybody who comes to depend on these platforms is implicated by the platforms, and this goes back to something that I first observed as a writer, which is that I wrote a book for Hachette, which is a big French publishing concern that was locked in a struggle with Amazon over ebook prices. And Amazon just bullied the hell out of Hachette. They made it, if they stripped buy buttons off of Hachette authors' books, they redirected searches to authors who weren't Hachette authors, but who'd written books on the same subject. And I saw this and I thought, as a writer, I am dependent on Amazon. Amazon is the biggest bookstore in the world. They control something like 70% of the ebook market and something like 50% of the total book market. Maybe, I think it's close to that now. I'm dependent on them. And their dependence is allowing them, in their size and their power is allowing them to treat producers badly. And ultimately, I think we need to shift to a paradigm where we're thinking about producers as well as consumers, because, interrupt me.
I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm going to say, okay, so even if I agreed with all your logic, let's assume I agree with all your logic, is the conclusion that one gets to, A, split those darn companies up. Let's make Amazon 3 competitive sellers, or we'll split it into 6 companies. There'll be 2 grocery companies, 2 book companies. That's one possibility. Just split the darn thing up. Another possibility would be, you know what, we're going to regulate these guys. You know, we're going to limit the amount of surveillance they can do. We're going to limit the amount of data they can have. Or you can say, we're going to mandate that they share the data that they have, right? So that no company has a monopoly over your personal data. Anything that Google collects or Facebook collects, they create, open data set you have to be able to share. Creates its own problems, but that's another thing you could do. So is it split it? Is it regulate? Is it force it to do things they wouldn't do? What do we want here?
All of the above. Why do I have to choose? All right, so part of the reason, I think you touched on a point initially, which was that I kind of walk right up to the edge of saying break up the companies, but I don't quite go there. And in part, I'm still the son of an antitrust lawyer, and so I have my dad sitting on my shoulder, kind of making. He was a very lonely combatant on behalf of the cause of busting up trust and of anti-monopoly, but also and kind of kept the issue alive during a period where it wasn't so cool, but also a super careful guy. And so I kind of had him on my shoulder as I was writing that, and I was like, I can't. I think it's right. I think we do want to consider. We do want to consider breaking them up, but it's so hard to get to that point from where we are at the present. The important point, and this is what I take away from Brandeis ultimately, is that you want there to be countervailing powers. That when you have an enormous concentration of power here, it needs to be met with some other force. And so I don't think we can get to the distant remedies for the problem. But let's start with the immediate one. Mark Zuckerberg should have to testify before the Senate. If you're Mark Zuckerberg, nobody has ever really challenged your worldview. And now you have a lot to answer for when it comes to fake news and foreign meddling in your election. And you should be held to account. Your worldview should be challenged, especially given your power. And we look at, I bet, I'm not sure you would agree with me on this, but I look at what happened in London with Uber. And I'm not sure it's good for London to have Uber kicked out, but what I do believe is that it's really important for London to stand up, because Uber is never going to reform itself. It's never going to behave like a better citizen. It's never going to treat its workers better. It's never going to work more in consonance with the common good unless there's some countervailing pressure applied for it. So ultimately, I would say it probably is healthier if Google's search business was culled from some of its other businesses.
Do you actually, is Uber, there's something happening in the world today which is kind of like the Uberization of the rest of Silicon Valley, right? So the approval ratings of the tech companies have always been at like 90%, and now they're kind of dropping down to like 80%. Like, Google, Facebook, Amazon. Facebook has probably dropped further than that because of the election. Uber has been at about 50% because of all the craziness. Do you kind of feel like public perception of Silicon Valley kind of needs to get to where it's been?
And it's not, right?
It's definitely not.
Yeah. I think elite. So this
make an argument that it shouldn't be. I'm just asking.
Yeah. So I think elite opinion is starting to shift pretty quickly. That the election certainly caused people to fundamentally caused elites to fundamentally rethink Facebook. That Facebook now faces critics on Capitol Hill and in various pockets of the mainstream media that it didn't face before. I think that within the Democratic Party, as the Democratic Party tries to come up with a response to Trump and to try to find some sort of way to channel the populism of the moment, I think that the Democratic Party is suddenly open to antitrust and to complaints about monopoly that it would have never uttered during the...
Slightly open. I mean, you've seen their donor base. The Democratic Party is going to tie themselves in knots the next 4 years, because there's going to be a whole faction of it that is reliant on Silicon Valley money, and there's a whole bunch of it that's going to be like, well, maybe we could do the populist thing and get antitrust against Silicon Valley. This is going to be really interesting political realignment.
No, I agree. And I think that it's actually going to split the left and it's going to split the right ultimately, because
Definitely.
there are pockets of the right. I shouldn't admit this to a Berkeley audience, but when you're selling books, you go places that you wouldn't necessarily go. And I'm gonna admit that I went on Fox News to talk about my book. All right, you're morally judging me. Don't judge me. Come on. But what was so fascinating.
I used to be a contributor on Fox. You should definitely go on Fox News.
Yeah, right.
You go on Fox News even if you're not selling books.
Right. So, so I went on Fox News, and there was complete agreement and openness with my critique of these companies, which comes from a corporate position, because Rupert Murdoch is an old-fashioned newspaper hack who hates Google and hates Facebook for reasons that probably have, that I articulated in my book, in fact. And so I do think that on the right, there is a wing of the populist right that doesn't like monopoly, that it fears that it's consistent. It fears concentrations of power, in government, and also fears private concentrations of power.
Can we do a poll of the audience? I'm just curious here. Everybody, I'm going to ask, maybe this is absurd, but how many people here believe that Facebook in general does more harm than good? I believe that's kind of how the Gallup poll is asked. Okay, more good than harm? All right, so it's like 70-30 for the bad side. Okay, that's enough.
Well,
Good,
I mean,
that's
I think a data scientist would probably say that there's some selection bias.
No, I'm just curious about where the room. I mean, it could have gone 100-0, at different points and different times. All right, we talked enough about antitrust. Let's talk about one of the other big themes of your book, which is journalism. So Frank tells the story quite well. You may have read it in the excerpt in the Atlantic Monthly. You may read it in the book about his time at the New Republic. One of the things that struck me, though, in your book is you make the argument that the journalism is not in the best shape. Wired, killing it. But journalism's not in the best shape. You make the argument in your book that actually the tech companies are happy about this and that they are pleased at the decline in journalism. So many people make the argument that technology companies are responsible.
I believe, can I just...
I'm on a roll, but you can keep going.
Oh, no, you can keep going, and I'll explain all the ways in which you're burlesquing my argument. No, I think that's basically my argument, but I don't think that they want the quality of journalism to be low. I think that they want journalism to be free on the internet, and I think that they're happy in a world in which the advertising market is deflated, because that's the market in which they are able to rule the roost.
But my sense, so I have two things I wonder. One, I've talked to lots of these technology executives. To the extent that they take responsibility for it, it seems very regretful. Like they seem like, and Facebook is starting all the journalism initiatives, Facebook really does seem to be questioning its role. Then secondly, I worked at the New Yorker prior to Wired, and the fundamental way we made money was through targeted Facebook advertising, like identifying readers and based on demographics and reading habits who were likely subscribers to the New Yorker, and then putting long-form stories that we thought they were likely to read, and then they were likely to subscribe. And we figured out like a way to sort of run the arbitrage and make money on that, right? So like Facebook was an amazing tool. A lot of your tote bags because of Facebook advertising for the New Yorker. By the way, I'd like to thank you for saying that we only published highly refined clickbait in your slight aside.
Not bad clickbait. Highly refined clickbait.
Highly refined clickbait is what I published in my previous chapter.
When you published clickbait.
No, that's true. It was actually very
When
nice.
I published clickbait.
It was your section about the New Yorker was very sweet. But do you, how do you respond to my claim that actually these technology companies, if used properly and harnessed correctly, can be a great boon for journalists? And two, elaborate on the sense that I got from your view that you think the technology companies take pleasure in the decline of the journalism industry.
All right, so I'll answer the second part first, which is that I'm just reading Jeff Bezos. I'm reading the way in which a lot of technology executives have decried gatekeepers in traditional media, and that one of the promises of new media was that it would break the chokehold that old media companies had on public opinion. And so I think that initially, at least, they took some gleeful pleasure at causing pain to old media. So that's
probably true.
But then you ask the question of, is it, all right, so what?
I feel like that's true, but that was less the large tech companies and more the kind of like, this is more like a 2001, we are the revolutionaries, we're shaking things up. That was like enjoying the pain to old media, but that, I don't feel like we've had that for like 6 or 7 years.
It's so interesting, but if you look at Jeff Bezos, up until the moment he buys the Washington Post and becomes old media, he talks about a world filled with gatekeepers, and he's really angry about it, because he feels like the old gatekeepers were just not responsive to markets, and that they didn't get it, that they were choking innovation. And I agree with you that you can't, with any of my generalizations, you'll be able to find plenty of people who evade the patterns that I'm describing. But I think I'm kind of broadly capturing the zeitgeist, or the way that the industry thinks. So can I just dwell for a second on why I think that's a problem? That
Please.
Anti-gatekeeper model.
It's a great part of your book.
So basically, the world needs gatekeepers. There's no way, especially right now, there's so much information. There's no way that we are able to sort through all the ubiquitous information in the world unless somebody imposes order on it and gives it a sense of hierarchy. And once upon a time, gatekeepers were newspaper publishers and magazine editors and people who ran radio stations and news networks, and they decided what went above the fold and what went on page 8, 10, and they had a sense of they were kind of self-important. Really, they wanted power in a lot of cases. They were cozy to power, but their sense of self-importance meant that there was also a sense of obligation that went with their job. That they weren't just putting anything on the front page. That they were making decisions that they thought would be good for their readers. We know this type of elitism, right? This is a very old, waspy type of noblesse oblige elitism that was prevalent for a lot of the 20th century among the American elite. Enter these new gatekeepers, and the new gatekeepers argue that those old gatekeepers were just self-protective. They wanted power, and they were making decisions that enhanced their power, but meanwhile, there was all this innovation in industry and diversity that was out there kind of waiting to explode. If only we could break their monopoly on power. And what we really needed were gatekeepers who were responsive to the market. I would argue that, and so what happens is that with Google and Facebook and Amazon, you have people who become very, very powerful gatekeepers because it's inarguable that they're performing that function. Yet because they view themselves as responsive to the market, they don't behave like gatekeepers. They deny the fact that they're gatekeepers. They don't want any responsibility for what they've done. That's kind of encapsulates the mess that Facebook's in with regards to these ads.
So do you think there is anything wrong about a journalist today saying, you know what, maybe they've had a negative effect on journalism, maybe not. But whatever it is, I'm going to study the hell out of them, and we're going to try to make as much money off them as possible, and we're going to try to use them to the best possible ends to get the most readers we can to do the best journalism possible? Or do you think that's a doomed enterprise?
It's hard.
Should I quit my job now?
Yeah. All right, I feel like I'm going to put Nick Thompson on the couch. Let me ask you a few questions, Nick.
No, seriously. Like, I'm obviously committed to this project, right? And my project is to publish the best journalism we possibly can with the best reporting, the stuff that you and I have both done. Frank and I knew each other as young reporters in Washington when we were this big. But you know, the project of what I'm trying to do right now is do that and then study Google, Facebook, and all these places and Snapchat and get Wired out into the world as best we can, study the algorithms, work with the algorithms, use Facebook ads if we can. Is that a doomed enterprise?
Well, so let me describe some of the problems that I see with it. And first, let me say that while we're having a mutual admiration society, one of the things, I do think that you've come into Wired, and I can't see the second part of it so much, but what I can see is that you've made an investment in trying to study the important things, and you've tried to treat technology as a subject that's not just about cool gizmos and about the latest release of products, but that you're actually trying to wrestle with some of the core questions here about the role of these companies in our lives. And is it problematic or dangerous to dabble in the dark arts of data and social media exploitation and the like? And I can answer this based on my own experience that gives you a sense of my anxieties about it, which was, so when the New Republic, this little magazine, very elite audience, weird alchemy of writing insider pieces about politics and long cultural essays, not really striving to get a big audience, but striving to get an influential and elite audience. And we had no idea about how to master the internet. And we just found ourselves completely disoriented by the advent of blogging and a lot of the changes of the 2000s. And we struggled to find an owner. And so I was editor of the magazine. I went around. I was up in New York all the time trying to hoodwink investment bankers into owning the New Republic. And so that was a pretty exhausting process, and I ended up leaving the magazine. And then in 2012, I came back because it was as if manna from heaven. a guy called Chris Hughes, who had been Mark Zuckerberg's roommate in college, one of the first employees of Facebook, said he wanted to buy the New Republic. And I couldn't believe my good luck, because this guy had deep, deep pockets. He professed a commitment to the serious things and the important things, and he knew social media because he'd invented the damn thing. So I thought, this is great. And so he asked me to come back and be editor of the New Republic again, and we set out to try to find a dignified way to navigate everything that was ailing journalism. And for about a year and a half, it was awesome. And we were spending money on the type of investments that nobody makes. We were able to send, in 2014, we sent somebody to Burma to write about the plight of the Rohingya, which, believe me, didn't necessarily move the traffic numbers when we reported it, even though it was a very good piece. But eventually, kind of the bill came due, and Chris said, you know what, we need revenue. I know I talked about all these high-minded things, and I still believe in these high-minded things, but we need revenue. And the only way we can get revenue is by growing web traffic. And the only way we can grow web traffic is if we create pieces that can spread on Facebook. And so if you're me, and you kind of, I barely spent, I mean, to be honest, I was just not a Facebook user. I had an account, I maybe posted a picture of my daughter on it once and then immediately regretted it. But so I had to kind of figure out how to master this really quickly. And Chris hired a data guru to work on our staff. And so I became acquainted with all the analytics that allow you to kind of try to figure out what works on Facebook. And basically, we got thrown into the giant popularity contest that is the worst of that Facebook has ushered into the world of journalism. And this is the thing that I fear, which is that everything became about the subject that was trending. Everything became about tapping into the anxieties and the emotions of readers on Facebook. Where we'd once narrowly targeted a small elite readership, suddenly our readership felt like the entire world. And all we needed to do was to produce the right headline with the right photo on the right subject. And so what I found was that we were gravitating in the same direction that everybody else was. We joined the herd. That Chris kept telling us, all you need to do is post a video of Jon Stewart complaining about something and give it a headline, and that'll bring clicks. And he wanted us to produce something that he called snackable content, which is not pieces about the Rohingya. You were writing things that people on their phones who were standing on the subway platform would want to read to decompress after work. And so my problem is really it's when you become dependent on Facebook for your financial health, you become dependent on the values of Facebook and the ecosystem of Facebook, and that led us in a direction. The New Republic had been a staunchly center-left publication, but I found that we gravitated much, much further to the left because that was where the traffic was. That if you wanted to appeal, it was easy to appeal to people's raw political emotions. So I found it actually distorting, and I found it distorting that our investment in resources was not geared to the places that we idealistically set out to pursue, but was geared towards writing about the same stuff that everybody else was writing about.
So I don't want to get too deep in this because we could talk about this for hours, but I would say that you just needed a different data analyst and a different owner, because really people will subscribe if you have the best story about the Rohingya and there's more money there for subscribing. I feel like your data analyst misled you. And if you had actually been measuring different metrics.
Is that working?
Yeah. I mean, it's working at Wired, it's worked at the New Yorker. I mean, who knows? Like it depends on the publication, it depends on the readers, and it depends on the story about the Rohingya. It has to be, but you wrote great stories and edited great stories. Right. I think you could have made a subscription model that totally worked.
So I would agree that to some extent, My Little Parable is kind of a reductio ad absurdum of of a magazine that probably had no business playing in this game. That it was
No,
contorting.
your magazine could totally have played it. I mean, the New Republic was great. Like, I feel like had the business model not been web advertising, had the business model been, we're going to sell subscriptions at $40 a pop or $50
Totally
a
agree.
pop, and we're going to do everything to measure subscriptions, and we're going to look at the stories that drive subscriptions, you would have seen that the Trump sucks story doesn't get subscribers, but here's in-depth reporting the Rohingya does. You would have
Right.
valued them differently because the economics.
I agree. I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that digital advertising is a huge part of the problem. I think that subscriptions are a potential salvation. I don't have a problem with using analytics shrewdly to make certain choices that we make. The problem that I have is that when I go into newsrooms, and I've been in a lot of newsrooms, there's a giant screen, maybe not that big, but pretty damn big, that lists what's popular at any given moment. And if you're a magazine editor, and I'm sure you're immune to this, but when I was a magazine editor, I had on my phone an app that was called Chartbeat, which I bet Wired has something much more sophisticated and better. You don't need to confess. But
Numbers?
But Chartbeat was this flickering needle that showed how popular any article was at any given moment. It showed where the traffic was coming from at any given moment. And part of the problem is that once you know what works, and once you start to carefully study what works, it becomes an obsession. And I don't think that I'm sure it's possible to conceive some sort of ecosystem where you buffer the obsession, but it's only human to want to win, and it's only human to want to be popular. And so I think the question is, once you have this Pandora's box of data open, how do you prevent it from infecting everything?
Well, I want to be popular, so I'm going to stop asking questions about journalism. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A, but my question is convoluted and hard, so you're going to have a little bit of time to think through your stuff. It's not that convoluted. It's not that hard. Your book is about Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. There's a lot about Google. There's a lot about Facebook. There's a lot about Amazon. There's not very much about Apple in your book. And I was wondering if that is A, because Apple actually has pretty strong privacy protections. Of all the big companies, it massively protects your privacy. Secondly, a lot of the stuff you talk about, distraction, advertising model, that drives Google and Facebook. Apple kind of, if you think about a lot of the problems in the world of tech, Apple is the one company that could fix them, right? So if you think about your phones as a distraction device, which is something you talk about, something you were just talking about in Chartbeat. The only company in the world that could actually change your phone so they stop being a distraction device is Apple. Right? Because Apple and Google control all the phones, either through Android or Apple. Google's not going to do it because it's in the advertising business, but Apple just sells hardware. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying, why is there not more about Apple? And is my hypothesis correct that there's not more about Apple because actually it doesn't violate some of the principles that are most dear to you in the book?
I think your hypothesis is partially correct, that Apple at least tries on some of these basic issues, but I do blame Apple for the core problem, which is that this thing in my pocket is the basis for all of the distraction, which is at the core of my book. I think that there were probably some editorial reasons why I wasn't as interested in Apple, which is that in some ways I was writing the book right after Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs book and Steve Jobs movies, and I just didn't feel like, I felt it was harder to approach Apple in a fresh sort of way. But I also think that when I was writing it, I probably just didn't appreciate how the phone, it's almost trite to say the phone is the basis for a lot of these problems. And maybe that was a reason I didn't say it. But the truth is that I don't know how many times a day I check my phone. And I would think I would be horrified to know the answer to that question. I think that there are apps that you can use to measure that. But one of the bitter ironies is that when I was writing this book, I was led to an app called Freedom. And what Freedom does is it basically cuts off the internet on your phone or your device for an hour or two at a time. You can monitor it. And Freedom's just another word.
There's an app called Moment, and what it does, it measures the amount of time you spend on an app, and then it tells you how much time you spent that week on the app. and then it asks you whether you're happy with it. And,
Have you used it?
I have used it, and I've studied the data of it. But the app that people are most unhappy with, first, Grindr. Second, Candy Crush Saga. Third,
I am so bitter about Candy Crush Saga.
third is Facebook, right? The apps people are happy with are Waze, Google Calendar, Evernote. And the things they're not happy they spend all their time in is, interestingly, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat.
Interesting. So I do feel like I probably in some ways gave Apple a little bit of a pass in this book.
All right, well, so now here we are. Break up Apple? Give it to him, Frank. There must be Apple engineers in the crowd.
Yeah. Break up Apple. Split the apple. Core the apple. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the things I want to do to Apple are make it pay its taxes. And I wish that, all right, it's great that they care about privacy and that they have ad blocking mechanisms I want them to make all of those things more of a default position. And even if they're good about data and privacy or better than the other guys, I still don't think that they're good. I don't know what the right antitrust application is for Apple. I don't know if it deserves to be broken up. It faces a lot of competition, at least from it faces a more competitive marketplace than some of the other companies.
But you worry about them as much as you worry about Google, Facebook, Amazon.
Do you want me to? Let's do the hierarchy of evil.
Yeah, I want that exactly.
So I'd say Facebook to me, apologies to any Facebook employees, but not really, is Facebook I would rank as the company that troubles me the most. I would say that that Amazon is probably the company that troubles me second most. Google troubles me third most, and Apple troubles me fourth most.
Right.
See, I went out there. He asked me. I was
Laid
very
it all
straightforward.
Out. Frank Foer's hierarchy of evil. I hope somebody has tweeted that. All right, so let's go to audience Q&A. We need to leave a little time before 8 o'clock. I believe the security detail leaves right at 8, and I need Frank to be able to sell and sign books so that he can make money even when he's blacklisted on Amazon for everything he said. Right there in the middle, that's the first hand I saw, which will be also the most inconvenient place to get a microphone. I think so the people in the back can hear. Here we go.
Okay, so I've read your book, and I listened to it on Audible with my phone.
Nice.
And the thing I appreciated most was your elucidation of the worldviews that sort of launched the tech industry and that it's producing today. And I'm wondering what the response has been in terms of intellectual engagement on these points from the tech industry and from stuff you published on these topics previously. I know the book is just out, so there may not be that much response yet. But I guess this question also could go to Nick, just what kind of intellectual engagement from tech leaders on these issues?
Right, so Google was second on my list, but when they engaged me, they dropped to third. No, I actually have talked to people. I've talked to people at Google who've been. I don't know if they'd actually read my book when they'd approached me, but they were at least interested in engaging on these issues. I kind of got the sense that they were aware that there was a backlash brewing, that they were there was concern about what was going to happen to the Democratic Party, and about how when Cory Booker, who, if you remember, when he remade Newark schools, took a lot of money from Zuckerberg, and that when Cory Booker was on a podcast earlier this summer, he basically said that the United States government needed to take action against these companies, and there was a sense, well that's going to be if even Cory Booker is going there, that's going to be the new default position of the Democratic Party. But I haven't had broad engagement with these companies. Oh, here's one story for you. So I did write a cover story about Amazon in 2014, and for the New Republic. And admittedly, the headline had fists. It was "Amazon must be stopped." Amazon. My timing arguably wasn't great on this because Amazon was just embarking on a big ad campaign on behalf of a television show, and they sent a note saying, essentially, I mean, it's not even essentially, it said, because of your cover story, we're pulling advertising from your magazine. Please acknowledge receipt of this note, the Amazon team.
Which Frank forwarded to the New York Times. Here in the front.
Hi, I thank you very much for this interesting talk. I wondered why you left eBay off the list, but let me say, in the past, say 6 months, I've ordered a couple things from eBay. I thought I was buying them from small sellers, and when they got delivered, they were packaged with Amazon Prime tape. You know, they had obviously come from Amazon. So has Amazon taken over eBay so that eBay hasn't taken over, you know, our lives in the way these other companies have?
I defer to Nick on that.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I'm guessing it's from individual sellers and they just had Amazon tape in their house, but I don't know the answer to that. Back here in the fourth row, but if I find out, we can figure it out.
So you make the statement that these are the new gatekeepers and they've replaced the New York Times and CBS News and whatnot. But I know that they would make the argument that they're just neutral platforms and the algorithm is a neutral algorithm and they're not, in fact, gatekeepers. And it's our interests as viewers that are driving the process. So how do you make the argument that they are, in fact, gatekeepers?
Right. So just to be clear, we live in they haven't replaced the New York Times and CBS, and it's that they've just become more powerful gatekeepers. But I think what you're describing fairly accurately reflects the attitude of these companies, which is what I described before, which is that they view themselves as just being sensitive to the markets. They believe, I think, sincerely that they've created algorithms that are neutral. The whole idea of a search engine is that it has this metaphor of being mechanistic, that it's as if there is no human involvement in the construction of the search engine. But we know, I mean, there are a couple things. One is we know that human beings are involved, that algorithms don't write themselves, that they come from human beings who have certain values, that there's a commercial imperative that these companies have, which is to have you click as many times as possible, to be as engaged as possible on their sites. And so that creates its own set of values. So with Facebook, the problem I have is that they've constructed algorithms based on data, which is this very intimate portrait of your mind and based on all of your habits and past preferences that they are then deploying to addict you. And so as gatekeepers, they are making decisions. We see this right now in a pretty obvious way, which is that Facebook over the course of the last year has decided that video is the thing that makes them the most money. And so that's the thing that Facebook has elevated in its algorithm. Is it neutral? Is it just that people suddenly have decided over the course of the last year that they want more video? No, it's not. It's because Facebook's business model has slightly shifted because they're worried about declining engagement levels and they view video as potentially salvation. And so there's a value involved in that decision. I like moving images plenty, but I also like words. And in their system, they've created a system where words are essentially devalued in their hierarchy.
Can I add one thing? Because I feel like the most important job right now are the engineers working on the Facebook algorithm. And the way the factors that you put into the Facebook algorithm profoundly affect our democracy. So if you just factor in what do people click on, what do people share, you get one thing, because that's like your instinct, what people feel like immediately, and it goes to your urges. If you start to factor in the amount of time that people spend once they click on something, suddenly you start to get a more sophisticated reading of what people are engaging with. If you take even more advanced metrics, like the number of people who share a story after reading it and the ratio of that to the number of people who share a story before reading it, you suddenly have a much more sophisticated analysis of the quality of a piece. So if Facebook could take all of the sort of sophisticated, high-quality measures that go into whether a story is good, whether a story is true, whether a story appeals to our sort of more profound, deeper selves, you could fundamentally transform the algorithm. If you just do what people click, what people share, what react, and you're just going all in, then you have a real problem, which is what Facebook has had. So Facebook engineers need to study this, and they can make a profound difference in our society.
Yeah, bravo. That was. I wish I talked to you before my book.
All right, we've asked all in the front, so how about in the very back row in the middle? Yes, right there.
Cool, yeah, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. The one thing I'm interested in is you talked a little bit about, or you talked a lot, I guess, about antitrust laws, and then you touched briefly on a strategy of boycott. Do you guys see kind of, okay, so let's say we're on the same page and we say we want to break up these big companies, which I am. Do you see strategies and solutions on kind of a grassroots level, like counter-hegemonic activity through networks or not through networks, besides just appealing to Congress and saying, you know, we need antitrust laws for tech companies?
That well, you're asking the question as individuals, perhaps even as communities, is there some sort of way for us to make choices that diminish the power of these companies? And I can give you a couple personal anecdotes. I think one thing that I think about all the time, and I think anybody who thinks about technology, is you think about your kids, because kids reflect back to us ourselves, and I think we have this instinct about how addicted we are to these devices and these platforms. Maybe we don't have the moment data. Maybe because we're scared to see the moment data about our levels of addiction. But when you sit and you see a 4-year-old, you know, compulsively watching YouTube videos of kids opening presents or whatever, or we watch a 4-year-old swipe through an iPad, there's part of you that I think recoils almost instinctually, because you know that addiction is real, and you see addiction forming, and that's kind of terrifying. And so with my own kids, I've tried to actually in some ways harden them to the realities of the world that we live in, which is that and actually explain this idea of addiction. One of the metaphors in my book is with food, in that 50 years ago, processed foods sprung on the scene, and they seemed incredible at the time. They were so efficient. You didn't have to go to the store anymore every day. You didn't have pots and pans to clean up. And then 50 years later, we woke up and we said, holy cow, these things were engineered to make us fat. They addicted us. It remade the whole economy of producing food. And it's a pretty terrifying metaphor in a lot of ways. If what's happening now to the things that we ingest through our minds is similar to the stuff that we ingested through our mouths. But there's a hopeful element to it too, which is that some people did awaken, and that there has been a backlash. And it may be largely at an elite level, but I think sometimes it extends beyond an elite level, where people make choices with food to try to choose the virtuous over the efficient. That we care about the origin and the quality of the things that we put in our mouths. And so I've tried to teach my kids just about food, and about the idea that there are in a capitalist society, addiction is kind of in some ways part and parcel of what happens. And we can tolerate that to some extent, but then there are things that we need to care about deeply, and where we need to resist the tendency to become addicted. And so I actually showed them a film that Katie Couric produced called Fed Up, which was about childhood obesity and about addiction to sugar, essentially. And then I've tried to explain to them some of the arguments in my book about how the phone and how these products are designed to addict us. And so having some measure of self-awareness, I think, is incredibly important. Not for ourselves, but maybe we can intervene with our kids, who are only going to be more, only breathing more heavily in the the same air. And I think the idea, there's another aspect to the idea, the organic metaphor, which is that we can make more virtuous choices when it comes to how we consume media. That if we know that quality media is important to us as individuals and it's important to our society, we need to make the same sort of choices that we make when we go to the farmer's market. That if you need to subscribe, we should subscribe to Wired or to the New York Times or the New Yorker or even other sites that are much more niche than that, because that's a more virtuous choice. I mean, there is, just to go back to Louis Brandeis for a minute, one of the things that Brandeis wrote about endlessly was the idea that everybody should be, people need to develop their faculties, was his phrase. And it was a motto of self-improvement. Everybody needs to in that one of the ends of government, he said, was to create conditions where citizens can develop their faculties. Because he had this innate faith in each individual to make good choices in a democracy. But that just doesn't happen, by accident. It has to happen in an incredibly intentional sort of way, where we can see this in ourselves, where we need, in order to get good information, we know we need to care about the information that we're getting, and it needs to happen in a national sort of way, especially after this election. I think that this election, has rocked us to the core, because we can see the ways in which something has gone basically wrong in our democracy, where conspiracy flourishes, where people are susceptible to demagogic appeals. And it's not enough to say that you yourself are exempt from it. We exist in an ecosystem. We exist in a society where we've let too many things go to shit. And I think pushing back against these companies and insisting that we have greater diversity, that we diminish concentrations of power, where we care much more deeply about the underlying health of our republic, is almost a necessity right now.
All right. I do not want things to go to shit with your book sales, but I do want the person in the very last row to ask a question. And then we're going to wrap this up and all go drink away the night and think about what Frank just said.
How will the future of American democracy and in relation to the individual mind relate to this, and how will you deal with people who've been addicted to this stuff since they were 4 years old?
So the question of addiction is really powerful. I don't have a great answer to it. All I know is that we can do better, and that a lot of what's happening in our country right now is that we just kind of accept the drift of things. We take it as it comes, because we have the sense that we don't have the ability to fundamentally affect our course. And so we're changing. We're changing as human beings. We're changing. Institutions that we care about are diminishing. Things that we care about, like privacy, may be disappearing. And we can accept that as inevitable. We can just say that the technology is just going to lead us away from privacy and be done with it, and accept that as it comes. Or we can say that as citizens, that we're gonna do something about it. We're gonna start to care about this, not just as an abstract good, but we're gonna care about it as something that's extremely precious to us. And that means understanding why privacy matters. I don't think most people actually give a whole lot of thought to why they care about privacy. That's why we squander it willy-nilly. But we just like the people of London have with Uber, just as NFL players kind of pushed back against power this weekend, we're not powerless. We have agency. We have the ability to try to make things better. It's not always easy. I don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. The questions are extremely, extremely hard, but I do think we can do better.
And Frank does have very good answers, and they're in this book, and it's available for $24.99 outside. Please buy it. Thank you, Berkeley. Thanks for inviting us here. Thanks for coming. Great. Thank you, Frank. That was lots of fun. Turn off my tape.